This is WJTS Inform. Hello, I'm your host, Bill Potter. Thanks for joining me. In the studio is Ken Eck, the Purdue Extension Educator, dealing mostly with ag, is what you really kind of specialize in?
We work with that mainly, natural resources and also community development a lot of times.
Okay, now we're going to talk about gardens in this edition of WJTS Inform, and people are itching to get out, or they've already been out working on their gardens, and I guess there's a lot of things to think about before you get started.
That's right. First of all, if you're going to start from scratch, which a lot of people are starting to come back to gardens because of just the economy. They heard, they knew Grandma and Grandpa used to have gardens. They maybe grew up with as kids with a family plot. But there's a lot of interest now in home canning and growing your own produce and knowing where it comes from instead of from the local box store where it might be. So a lot of people are interested in doing that. So if you already have an established garden, you pretty well know what you're doing from family history, but a lot of people are starting from scratch here in Jasper or Huntingburgford, any place else. If you're looking for a good garden, a good place to put a garden in your backyard, start off by trying to find a place that's fairly level, well drained, not a lot of trees around it or shrubs or things that might interfere with it. A lot of established gardens, my own garden for example, we had some nice small trees 20 years ago, and now we have large pecan trees that are kind of causing some issues with our garden. So that's something we need to work with, and you can correct that by simply going through and maybe pruning off the roots with a root plow, it's called. You cut the roots, and then the tree still lives from roots on the other side, but it keeps it out of the garden where it takes away some of the nutrients and moisture and things in the middle of July and August. So pick a good garden spot, look for good soil, it's friable, it falls apart, shouldn't be too sandy or too sticky with clay, and go from there.
Let me ask you this, does size make a difference?
You probably need to think about what you want. My family, when I was a kid, we had 3 huge gardens. One was for potatoes, one was for certain types of crops and sweet corn, things like that, and tomatoes, and the other was a very diverse garden. My mom was traditional old German-style gardening type person, and it was what my family needed to provide most of the crops we had and to can for food throughout the winter. So if you're just going to eat some nice fresh vegetables, or to start off, I'd say start smaller, and then work your way up as you get more into it and decide that you have the tools, tillers and hoes, or maybe a supply of labor, like several kids that are interested in gardening and like to do that. But just start small and work your way up if you have the room in your backyard someplace. Once you've got a garden, either a new one or an established one you already have, people really need to think about what they want to put in the garden. Lay the garden out, so if you have certain crops like cold crops like broccolis and lettuce and spinach, which we plant earlier in the season, you'll probably get a chance to plant more crops behind those. So put those off to one side and then lay out in your garden, just sketch a little plan as to which row is going to have what crop in it, and kind of figure out what time you want to plant those crops too. Don't plant all your sweet corn at one time, for example. Plant some this week, plant some in 2 or 3 weeks, and then plant some maybe a month or 2 from now. So that way you have a constant supply of produce coming in your garden instead of having too much that you have to share with your neighbors or friends, which is good too. Maybe they'll share back. But you can kind of schedule things for what your family might eat, and you have a constant supply of fresh produce on your table that way. Something else to think about is if you have like asparagus or strawberries or something that's going to be there year after year. Asparagus can last for 20, 30 years in some cases. Just replace them once in a while. But put those off to the side. So you can go through with a garden tiller and till up one large, or if you have a small tractor and plow, you can go through and do the whole garden at one time instead of having to have a strip through the middle where a perennial crop like the asparagus or strawberries might slow that down. Okay. The other thing to think about when laying on a garden is try to put the tall crops in the back. Put the corn, the tomatoes that are up on stakes, the pole beans towards the back so that you don't have shade that might block out smaller things like bush beans or carrots or something like that. Shade isn't a big issue, but it still can have an effect on how much produce you might get. As far as the next thing to think about once you've got the garden laid out is you need some kind of way to till it, of course. That might be a small tractor and plow. If you're out in the country, and in town it's usually more traditionally something like a power rototiller. There are several name brands and all of them are good as long as they can turn the soil over, and usually you try to do that for about 4 to 6 inches deep. That's also a good time if you're putting in fertilizers or manures to try to till that in so it's incorporated where the roots will be at, and so your crops will do better during the year then. As far as fertilizer goes, what I'd recommend is at least every 2 or 3 years look at trying to do a soil test. You can do that. We have soil test kits in the extension office here out by Vincennes University Jasper Center. that you can pick up. You simply go out with a small trowel, take several samples across the garden, put in a bucket, mix it up really well, put in a little bag, and that bag goes into a larger envelope that gets sent to the testing facilities, and they tell you exactly how much you need to put it on for your next crop. If it's a regular garden, they'll say you'll need so much pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, as well as tell you exactly what's in your soil, so you know what you have as well as what you need. And that costs about $15, I think. As far as fertilizer goes, again, the best time to put fertilizer on is when you're trying to incorporate or mix the soil up so it gets down the root area. If you don't have a chance to do that, you can put it on later on, but it's a little more difficult to get it in the ground where the plants need to have it. When we're looking at different sources of nutrients, it can be things like compost. It can be commercial fertilizers you might buy at a box store or an ag supply store or a local nursery of some type. It can be animal manures, which we have a lot of in this county. And it just basically you need to know how much nutrients are in each of those types of things so you can plan for what your soil test might tell you need. When you buy commercial fertilizer, a lot of times you'll have a number on the side. It'll say like 10-10-10 or 10-20-10 or something like that. And what those are, they tell you the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium amounts in the soil or in the bag. So if you have a 100-pound bag and it says 10-10-10, it means you have 10% or 10 pounds of nitrogen, 10 pounds of phosphorus, and 10 pounds of potassium. So if you need to put on 10 pounds of nitrogen according to the soil test, you put on a 100-pound bag then on that certain area. So it's relatively simple, but it takes a little bit of math. Organic matter, well, one of the things too is pH. pH is how much hydrogen is in the soil, and that affects how much nutrients are going to be available to your plant. So if you have too high of a pH or too low of a pH for your garden, certain nutrients may not be available even though they're in the soil. They're tied up. It's just like high school chemistry. Again, it's all tied up in there, and it can't be released until you get back to a certain range, usually about 6 to 7 pH. So again, soil tests and things will tell you those numbers and how much lime you need to add, and goes from there. Organic matter. Organic matter is anything that comes from a plant like leaves, straw, mulch, things like that. And it's really good to try to go out and compost anything you might want to put in your garden. You can take leaves or grass clippings, things like that, and turn it into really a good source of nutrients for your plants. It also helps with soil tilth and helps trap the moisture there in the summer when you might have a drier season. The big thing to try to do is try to let it mulch for a long time. What that does is the mulch, as it breaks down the organic matter, it starts to get hot, and it'll cook any insects that are in there, and it'll also break down the weed seeds that might cause problems in your garden later on.
Okay, because I was going to say, you know, if you put this mulch in your garden, aren't you putting weed seeds in there?
Yep,
okay.
you can in some cases.
If you compost it long enough.
Yes, yep.
Okay.
You throw it in the fall and take it off in the spring, you've got a chance for it to cook over the winter and through the fall, and a lot of times I'll heat it up enough that the weed seeds will be inactivated or broken down if nothing else.
Okay.
Again, for the compost and organic matter, it's best to work it in so it's down in the root zone. You can use that compost later on too if you want to try to mulch certain plants. But again, you want organic matter in the soil just to have something there to provide nutrients. It's kind of released a lot slower than what a commercial fertilizer might, and adds tilth so you can get the roots to go through it and you can work it up better too when you're trying to do some weeding later on in the season. As far as seeds go, think about the seeds you use, new or best. New seeds are best seeds, but some people save seeds. Mm-hmm. Some of those seeds are good for maybe up to 5 years, depends on the crop. Onions, corn, and things like that, maybe 1 or 2 years. Smaller seeds like beets, broccoli, cantaloupes, and watermelons might last up to 4 or 5 years. So other thing we talked
for doing that, is there a chance that a certain amount of those seeds won't grow?
Yes.
Is that why?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, because I have a lot of seeds left over from last year, but I guess there's a certain percentage of that won't grow. But,
yes, and new seeds will tell you what percent they are on the packet.
Okay.
But if you want to, you can do what's called a ragdoll test. You take about 20 seeds, put it on a damp but not wet, but a damp paper towel, mm-hmm. roll them up and let them sit in the windowsill for a couple days. Open it up and see how many out of those 20 seeds sprouted, and you can do the math then to figure out, you know, if you have 20 and half of them sprouted, you have a 50% germination rate.
Okay.
And if you get down below 60 or 70%, you probably shouldn't use the seeds. If it's higher, you just maybe put a few extra seeds out there, and you know it's good to go then.
Well, and really, seeds aren't that expensive anyway.
That's right.
So,
yeah.
Better to go new right away.
That's right.
Okay.
Transplants, we're talking about things like tomato plants. A lot of people like to do those. You can also get things like broccoli, cucurbits like watermelon, things like that at local box stores. Look for good, healthy plants that don't look yellow or have any problems or black spots from disease. You're going to pay for either a good one or a bad one, so pick out a good one.
Okay.
You know, use your money wisely. And the final thing to think about is water sources. If you're going to have a small garden, maybe carrying in buckets is fine, but if not, you need to have maybe a water source like a faucet, so you can run a hose out there and sprinklers. Think about mulches. After you put down tomato plants, maybe put mulch next to it to keep the weeds down as well as trap moisture in July and August when we're trying to get produce off of some of these plants. So with that, if you have more information, need more information, the Purdue Extension office is located again out by Vincennes University Jasper Center, or we have a website that gives more information online at www.extension.purdue.edu/DuBois.
Okay. Now, do you mind phone calls from people saying, hey,
No,
my tomato plants are doing this, what am I doing wrong?
Yep, no, that's no problem. We do that all the time. We also have a disease diagnostic center up at Lafayette where people, they bring in certain plants, rose bushes that have concerns with diseases and things. We send them up there. Other things sometimes we see more frequently I can handle directly because we just simply know what's going on in the county. When the first 5 guys come through or ladies come through with a certain disease and we see the exact same thing on the next 5, we can kind of help them out right away, whereas certain specific things we have to send off just to find out what the specialists on campus might tell us.
Now, for a garden, is there too small a garden? I guess even if you do one tomato plant, you're gardening.
That's right, and there's also called things called container gardens, where you can simply get a 5-gallon bucket in the backyard, put a nice tomato plant in it, some potting soil, put some holes in the bottom so you can water it, and the water will pass out if there's excess water there, and even in the middle of Jasper or Huntingburg, you can still have your own little garden on the back patio.
Okay, so gardening is a great way to go. It's a lot of fun and gives you some good fresh produce.
And especially if you have kids in the family, to see where the food comes from and understand what's going on, and they have some ownership in why they should eat their vegetables once in a while.
Well, one other question, tomato plants, you're supposed to plant those around Mother's Day.
Yeah.
Is it okay to plant them again in June?
Yeah. One of the things we have out there on our website, too, is there's listings for garden tips. And it tells you a whole listing of what plants you can plant certain times of the year. In July and August, it's really too dry for most plants to be planted. They dry out. There's heat that causes problems, the heat stress, as well as direct sunlight, but it's more the heat of the garden more than anything. And so you have to watch it. We try to do things a little bit earlier or a little bit later when you get more in the fall if you have enough time to grow an entire crop. But you can still go out in June or so. You have to watch the watering and watch some of the heat and things out there.
Okay. Well, Ken, thank you very much for coming in.
Okay. Thank you.
Our guest has been Ken Eck with Purdue Extension, and thank you for watching WJTS in Form. Now let's get out and do some gardening.